Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time of Sukkot, the time that we had to rest and all get together. For those of us that were able to spend all that time at the campground and spend time in your Word and hang out with the prophets and just enjoy an overall good time. And Lord God, we thank you for the safety of the people that are there, that other than for a few sniffles and a few bug bites that always seems to happen when you're out in the woods for all this city people. We thank you for the safety of the people that are there and the ability for all to get home safe. Lord God, tonight I bind up the powers of darkness that have a place here across the four walls of this building, even within the phone lines tonight, even across YouTube. Lord God, loose the angels to come forth from the very throne room of God to bring that anointing and touch the hearts and the minds of the people. And that way the words that I speak are the words that you want spoken unto them. In the name of your Holy Son, Yeshua. Amen. All right, so let's continue in with the teaching of seaboard as we begin to teach about that. Now that we begin to understand the Nephilim and the giants and where they come from, before we go any further down the rabbit trail that we have gone in for the past couple of weeks, and especially after last week and after the week before that, we need to begin to look at the people upon the earth after the fall of Adam and Eve when they got kicked out of the garden. And we need to begin to understand their side of what was happening at the same time as the angels and the watchers were beginning to come down upon Mount Hebron. Now, when Seth was 105 years old, he fathered Enos. Now, the book of Jasher states that this is when the first rebellion after the garden had begun. Start in Jasher 2 through 5. And Seth lived 105 years, and he begat a son. And Seth called his name of his son Enosh, saying, because in that time the sons of men began to multiply and to afflict their souls and hearts by transgressing and rebelling against God. And it was in the days of Enosh that the sons of men continued to rebel and transgress against God to increase the anger of the Lord against the sons of men. And the sons of men went and they served other gods, and they forgot the Lord who had created them in the earth. And in those days the sons of men made images of brass and iron, wood and stone, and they bowed down and served them. And every man made his god, and they bowed down to them. And the sons of men forsook the Lord all the days of Enosh and his children, and the anger of the Lord was kindled on account of their works and abominations which they did in the earth. Now, unbeknownst to me and some other people, as we begin to teach about these things we begin to start in, one of the little kids asked one of the guys, how come, with Prophet Mike says that everything happened twice, how come the great flood only happened once? Well, because of what they had done, God had occurred a flood that destroyed the crops and afterwards caused a drought. Jasher 2, 6 through 7. And the Lord caused the waters of the river Gihon to overwhelm them, and he destroyed and consumed them, and he destroyed a third part of the earth. And notwithstanding this, the sons of men did not turn away from their evil ways, and their hands were yet extended to do evil in the sight of the Lord. And in those days there were neither sowing nor reaping in the earth, and there was no food for the sons of men, and the famine was very great in those days. So God had already showed what would happen if you made him mad long enough, he would already bring a flood. So yes, he did flood the whole earth, but he did start it out and did a third of it on the first round. Now when Enosh was 90 years old, he fathered a child named Canaan. Now Canaan walked in the ways of his great-grandfather Adam, and you can read this in Jasher 2, 11 through 13. And Canaan grew up, and he was 40 years old, and he became wise and had knowledge and was skilled in all wisdom, and he reigned over all the sons of men, and he led the sons of men to wisdom and knowledge, for Canaan was a very wise man, and he had understanding in all wisdom, and with his wisdom he ruled over spirits and demons. And Canaan knew by his wisdom that God would destroy the sons of men for having sinned upon the earth, and that the Lord would in latter days bring upon them the flood of the waters. And in those days Canaan wrote upon tablets of stone what was to take place in times to come, and he put them in his treasures. Now when Adam was 365 years old, he made Canaan king over the whole earth, and you can read about this in Jasher 2:14. And Canaan reigned over the whole earth, and he turned some of the sons of men to the service of God. Now during this time of Canaan's reign, bringing people back to the Word of God, it lasted about 40 years before the people began to rebel again. And we're going to read this in Jasher 2, 19 and 20. For in those days the sons of men began to trespass against God and to transgress the commandments which he had commanded to Adam to be fruitful and multiply in the earth. And some of the sons of men cause their wives to drink a draught that would render them barren, in order that they may retain their figures, and whereby their beautiful appearance may not fade. So in other words, they sterilized themselves, because the guys didn't want the wives to get fat when they had a kid. Now, when Enoch was 165 years old, he fathered Methuselah. Now, after his birth, Enoch began to move closer to God and began to become the middleman for the watchers and the fallen ones and God. Now, in Enoch 12, 1 through 6, it says, "Before these things Enoch was hidden, and no one of the children of men knew where he was. Hidden and where he abode, and what had become of him. And his activities had to do with the watchers, and his days were with the holy ones. And I, Enoch, was blessing the Lord of majesty and the King of the ages, and lo, the watchers called me, Enoch the scribe, and said to me, Enoch, thou scribe of righteousness, go and declare to the watchers of the heavens, who have left the high heaven, the holy eternal place, and have defiled themselves with women, and have done as the children of earth do, and have taken unto themselves wives. Ye have brought great destruction on the earth, and ye have no peace nor forgiveness of sin. And inasmuch as they delight themselves in their children, the murder of their beloved ones shall they see, and over the destruction of their children shall they lament, and shall they make supplication unto eternity, but mercy and peace shall they not obtain." So now that ties right in real very well with what happened as we talked about during Sukkot, at the beginning of it, where it talks about that time where he sat down and had to begin to tell them of the destruction of the giants and how they would watch their children die, and how they would live 500 years upon the face of the earth, and the Lord God would destroy them. But now, during this time, Canaan had made Enoch a ruler of the people because of what he was able to do and where he had been. So Enoch himself, as you can look at it too, also was a king. Now, after Enoch was taken up to walk with God and the Elohim, the sins of men who were being further corrupted by the Nephilim and the giants began to mix of the field and the fowls of the air, beasts of the field, fowls of the air, and as the fallen had begun to teach them, which is the exact same thing that we're seeing today as they begin to splice animals from the field, beasts of the air, fowl of the air, beasts of the field, and begin to splice them together with other DNA and also with human DNA. And we can read about this in Joshua 4, 16 through 18. "And all the sons of men departed from the ways of the Lord in those days, as they multiplied upon the face of the earth with sons and daughters, and they taught one another their evil practices, and they continued sinning against the Lord. And every man made unto himself a god, and they robbed and plundered every man his neighbor, as well as his relative, and they corrupted the earth, and the earth was filled with violence. And their judges and their rulers went to the daughters of men, and took their wives by force from their husbands according to their choice. And the sons of men in those days took from the cattle of the earth, and the beasts of the field, and the fowls of the air, and caught them, the mixture of animals and one species of another, in order therewith to provoke the Lord. And God saw the whole earth as it was corrupt, for all flesh had been corrupted in its ways upon the earth, all men and all animals. Now we can begin to see what Yeshua was stating in Matthew 24:37 when he said, "But as in the days of Noah were, so shall be the coming of the Son of Man be." Because during those times of Noah, the exact same things that they are doing now are the exact same things that they were doing then. Well, now, while all this was going on, there was also the beginnings of a great war was beginning to brew. Now, Josephus writes about the Sethonite and the Canaanite wars. Now, Josephus writes, "And when Cain had traveled over many countries, he with his wife built a city named Nod, which is a place so called. And there he settled his abode, where also he had children. However, he did not accept of his order of his punishment to amend, but to increase his wickedness. For he only aimed to procure everything that was of his own bodily pleasure, though it obliged him to be injurious to his neighbors. He augmented his household substances with much wealth. By raping and by violence, he excited his acquaintances to produce and procure pleasures and spoils by robbery. And he became a great leader of men into wicked courses. He also introduced a change in that way of simplicity where men lived without before, and was the author of weights and measures. Whereas they lived innocently and generously, while they knew nothing of such arts, he changed the world with cunning craftiness." So Josephus was sitting down, was writing about the things that happened. And me and Prophet Paul were talking about this, and we were reading about one of the books, which I'll talk about next week, that he said had been recreated, but they could not prove that the recreation was correct because the original manuscript had been destroyed. So we begin to talk about this thing with Josephus. And why was it that Josephus had this knowledge as an Adam had 33 sons and 23 daughters? Why do we know all these things, but we can't find any record of this anywhere? It's because when Josephus was alive, he had access to these records. Now, I have realized that in the writings of Josephus and the writings of the Greeks, a lot of the timestamps are dated and they're dated wrong. But he had access to these writings. He had access to these things while they were still available. Well, how is that possible? Well, it talks about in history that there was one king of Nineveh, one of the original kings. He had 30,000 clay Sumerian tablets in his library. Where are those tablets? See, they get very excited when they go dig in the desert in Iraq and they find a tablet and they go in there and they brush it off and it's in the news for 6 months and they get all excited and the guys decipher it and realize it was talking about a tax bill, sale of a cattle. But this gentleman had 30,000 tablets. Think about the Library of Alexandria that no longer exists. What about it? It got burned to the ground with all those writings that were in there. These are the things these writers of old were studying. They had access to these writings, the writings of Josephus. Then it also talks about that Jacob sat down and he buried 35 books that Enoch wrote. So when he sat down and burned, he buried 35 books because the knowledge scared him. And he was afraid that what happened before the flood would happen after the flood. He made sure they were hidden so it could never be used against the people again. So we know that there are additional writings that are out there and other parts of knowledge that are available. And so we're relying upon the people that were there that read those writings and they could sit down and put it in common day language for us to understand. But we also know that even to the posterity of Seth, as it continued across, and as they continued to esteem God, in the 7th generation, it began to become corrupted and perverted. By the 10th generation, it was just as bad as all the other generations that came after it. Now, Josephus writes, this posterity of Seth continued to esteem God as the Lord of the universe and to have an entire regard to virtue for 7 generations. But in process of time, they were perverted and forsook the practices of their forefathers. And they did neither pay their honors to God, which they were appointed to them, nor did they have any concern to do justice towards men. But they, for what degree of zeal they had formerly shown for virtue, they now had shown by their actions a double degree of wickedness, whereby they made God out to be their enemy. And for many angels of God accompanied with women, they begat sons that proved unjust and despisers of all that was good. On account of the confidence they had in their own strength, for the tradition is that these men did what resembled the acts of those whom the Grecians call giants, or what the Hebrew called Gabor. Now, at this time, we know that great sin was upon the earth. And when we have discussed in the previous teachings, the fallen have arrived around the 6th or 7th generation. The meaning of the word Jared means descent. And when they talk about when the angels came down, they came down when? During the time of Jared. They descended upon Mount Hermon. Now, giants were being produced by the sin of the fallen with the daughters of the Son of Men. Now we can just add the last of the teachings that we have done to this series, and we can begin to continue forward with the punishment of the watchers, and as we begin to go forward to the wars of the giants. Now, one thing I want to talk about within this teaching is to understand that we're pulling a lot of elements from a lot of areas and a lot of places and a lot of knowledge in order for this to become beneficial. So you begin to blend in books that you do not have. That does not mean you have to go run out and find the latest and greatest book that has all of them or has this or has that. It is better to be able to sit down and be taught this information until you can grasp onto this information and can interact with the foundation that you have already set. Then you have the ability to sit down and build that foundation greater by purchasing that material and studying it. And the reason I say that is because what happens is there's a reason Prophet did not sit down with us in the garage and begin to tell us a lot of these things that he was studying into and where he was getting it, because he knew we would all 10 of us would have ran home. We all would have sat down and we would have spent all this money on all these books. And we begin to read it, and it would begin to corrupt our knowledge in these ways and things in which we've been studying. Because then all of a sudden, you would sit down and read it, and you would study it, and all of a sudden realize all this information you got, and then you'd always try to one-up a prophet. Well, in Jubilees chapter 5, verse 17, it says this, and you should have added that to Jasher 6, and the verse said that. That's not necessary. When we get to those points in times, we get to those points in times. But just like we had happen in Sukkot with myself and Prophet Paul as we were beginning to teach, there was a reason I dropped off at chapter 9, because I was told to. I had no idea that Prophet Paul picked up in chapter 10 and went all the way through and continued on with the teaching. So he continued on with a whole other section, and that allowed me to sit down and go, okay, let's go back and look at these guys were doing before that time as we can get to chapter 6 of Genesis, as we get to chapter 6 of Enoch. And we begin to apply all these things and begin to bend and blend and bend into both halves of that into one, so we can begin to understand why these things are beginning to happen that way. As we move forward across this time scale and begin to understand what the watchers really did. The thing about it is, the key to this is to understand what the names of Seth and his generations meant. The key to this is to understand what Cain and his generations and their names meant. And then it's also key to this to understand what the watchers and what they taught and what their names meant. And then when you blend all these things together, they begin to tell you a story of what was happening as it led up to that point. Now, there's things within this that I didn't get into tonight that I may never get into, but it even talks about that Adam sat down and wrote writings for Seth and for Canaan, that he sat down and he prophesied the flood that was coming in Noah's day. He sat down and prophesied the destruction. But I don't have those writings to back it up, so I was going to teach that. But there are a lot of things that are there begin to tell you within how these things line up and why they walk through. And then you can really begin to understand. We just think that when it says down, it says, wickedness was great upon the face of the earth, and God said, I got to destroy it, and now I'm sad I made it. And Noah, we're going to save you, and have you and your sons build an ark. It doesn't make a lot of sense why the same wickedness that we sit down today that we look at was going on then, but somehow that deserved to have a flood, but the wickedness that we're working through today didn't have to have a flood. We don't understand why it was that. But as we begin to progress through these teachings from the time of Canaan into Enoch and begin to carry through, we begin to realize why these things were important, why God did it. Well, yes, all the flesh in the earth was wicked, and all the flesh was corrupted, and all the DNA had been changed, and all these things had happened. But what led up to that? And then after the flood and all these things were gone, said, and done, all of a sudden you start reading about giants again. But there's no second disposition of these boys that are ascending back upon any mountain. But all of a sudden there's giants again. And it talks about that Abraham had giants in his army of 312 or 318 as he began to go out, because he was a king. He ran and ruled the territory. It was his. And he went to war. He begins to talk about these things. Where did all these guys come from? What did they do? Well, as you begin to piece things that happened before the flood, and you begin to piece these things together, you begin to see how a lot of these things kept going on during the flood. So when we get down into this thing, when it begins to talk about Noah, his 3 sons, the 3 wives, and Noah's wife, you begin to start understanding more, because we sat down and we began to teach these things when we were younger, and we learned all these things from Bible school, and pastors are going to teach you what it is that they know, and they had no really idea what they were talking about. They had King James, or NIV, or ESV, or this Bible, or that, one of the 22 or 26 or 33 different translations of the Bible, however you call it. And that's all they had. They sat down and pulled these things, and they began to tell you that the flood happened because God was so irritated and so pissed off because all the great wickedness, and this is why homosexuality is bad. That's not why the flood happened. But they didn't have a problem with that back in the early 80s and early 90s, saying that because they couldn't piece together, or still haven't pieced together, or refused to piece together all the things that were happening. So all these things are important and have knowledge to know. But that does not mean right now you need to go run out and buy all these things, because as I had the discussion with some of the prophets, it's very simple. If your foundation of the Word of God is not set and is not solid, and you don't have that knowledge that is there, and you begin to sit down and read the 4 books of Enoch, and the referencing within, and you begin to sit down and read Jasher, you begin to sit down and read Jubilees, and you begin to sit down and read the books of the Apocrypha, and you begin to sit down and read all these other things that are non-biblical or assumed to be non-biblical books, and you begin to sit down and read into the things of the Sidar Omar, and you begin to read into that. You're sitting there reading all these things, and you're going, now I'm just confused. I have no idea what's going on. They're trying to save you from the confusion before you get to it. But the same thing is, at the same time, this knowledge is important to understand how it intersects, because these other books are adding to what is in the original book of Genesis that was there. Moses didn't put all that stuff in there because Moses is sitting down and going, you've got Jasher, you've got Jubilees, you've got Enoch. You're supposed to already know all these things. Why was it that Yeshua and the boys sat down and says, as it is written in the book of Jasher, as it was written in the book of Jubilees? Why would they say that if it wasn't already being used? Because it was designed to be learned, it was designed to be studied, but at the same time, it was designed to be understood. And if you understand it wrong, because the knowledge and the revelation knowledge has not been given to you, it will confuse you, it will mess you up. But when you can sit down and begin to piece it all together, and you begin to make it all blend, and you begin to make all these other things that are there and all these other books add to what is already there. We already know the Genesis story, and we already know that most of that is symbolism. We already know what happened to Cain and Abel. But it also says within those books, it says that the reason that Cain didn't get his offering accepted is because of his lineage. Well, he came from Adam. Well, maybe not. We're not sure about this. So again, it's very important to understand these things. Hey, I was taught in Sunday school that the reason that God did not accept Cain's offering was, and he accepted Abel's blood offering, was because Cain, well, he just gave the worst that he had in the field. He gave the leftover. That's not what it says. In Genesis or Jubilees or Jasher, that's not what it says. But that's what we were taught. Why? Because they did not know the answer to those questions, but they had to pretend they knew the answer to those questions. Because nobody likes a 6 or 7 or 8-year-old, as one of the little boys over here says, well, Prophet Mike says, God says he does things multiple times, how come it only happened once? Well, now I showed it happened twice. But nobody likes that when that happens because they can't answer those questions. So they'll make up an answer that sounds good to them to make you shut up. I don't want you to shut up. I want you to experience it. I want you to learn it. I want you to study it. I want you to ask questions. I want you to listen to the prophets because they're teaching along the same lines of the same things, and begin to blend all that together and understand the direction in which it is we're going. Because these teachings are important. And we're going to make sure that those teachings are always available for you online. So, let's go ahead and go to prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time of Sukkot as it begins to end for us. And we thank you for this time that we've been able to sit down, and for a vast majority of us, sit down and relax and enjoy the company of each other around the campfires and the campers. Yes, God, was it uncomfortable when we were outside our elements? Yes, it was. Was us little city slickers not used to those little yellow bees that run around and just started stinging everybody, which myself got hit with? No, we're not used to that. But you know what? It took us out of our element and made us enjoy the nature in which you created. And it allowed us to sit down in fellowship for all of us to build the bonds closer and have a good time. And Lord God, as people that come outside of Ephraim begin to come in and they begin to want to sit down and experience these things, may you also sit down and open the joys, not of the bondage that is there that has been told to them that you have to do, but of the pureness of which Sukkot is, the relaxation that you designed it to be for us, to sit down in that festival time and enjoy not only the company of our brothers and sisters, but also the company of God when he is within the camp. Lord God, we thank you for that and for the safety in which it is that you showed all of us this week, and you will continue to show all of us in the weeks to come. And Lord God, we thank you in the name of your Holy Son, Yeshua. Amen. Now again, until next week, when we continue on and begin to dig deeper into it, I'll see you all again at that time. You all have a good night.